Okay, I'm going to start. So we're going to cover migration, forced displacement, and refugee crisis this week. And this is the layout. We're going to highlight the major theoretical approaches that tackle, these issues like the migration and refugee crisis, mainly the push and pull theories and historical structural approaches. And we're going to highlight what are the main shortcomings in these two theoretical approaches. And then we are going to focus on how this interdisciplinary field of refugees and migration and these kind of studies emerged recently, but still nation states still adopting these nation state centric approaches. So we're going to highlight how the main approaches in these kind of streams of the existing studies by highlighting mainly either the focusing on the sending states or receiving states or the internal displacement within the state as a sovereign entity. So still a state-centric approach to these kind of issues, migration and refugee crisis. And when it comes to the refugees, the major approach or the major conceptual framework is multi-level governance of refugee crisis. This would juxtapose the international organizations or UN agencies to the state policies in order to highlight, what kind of discourse international organizations adopt and what kind of policies nation state would pursue in order to abide by these international standards to protect or to give rights to refugees. And then the newly emerging trend with what's called migration system theory that actually brings together different trends from anthropology and sociology in order to bear on the subject, mainly highlighting two main frameworks, the historical context and the individual narratives of the individuals. And we are going to focus on the Kurds and the social construction of place, within, away from these kind of territorial spaces, and the agency of the migrants in hosting countries, instead of highlighting mainly or focusing heavily on the state policies, sending or receiving or internal displacement when it comes to the state policies. These trends or these theoretical trends tend to highlight the agency of the migrants, either by how they affect the policies and the social structures and the social organizations in the hosting countries, or highlighting these kind of individual narratives in order to bring out, the narratives of these individuals and how they socially construct their mental images or sense of community. And then this is what we will leave it there. And then in the seminar, we're going to highlight three main issues, like the role of politics and power when it comes to the how state would change the position of different natives and citizens, highlighting the settler colonialism as the under-researched area in these studies, highlighting mainly the issue of the Palestinians, the displacement of the Palestinians in relation to Israel, and two other issues regarding the internal displacement in Egypt and Sudan, and the encampment policies and securitization and political economy of immigration policies and refugee policies. Okay, so let's start with the traditional theoretical frameworks approaches to immigration and refugee issues. Any guess on why people would ever leave their countries and cross borders and to live or to make a living in a different country? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, correct. So this is it goes like perhaps they highlight, these economic and geopolitical factors in these kind of recent interdisciplinary studies. People actually voluntarily or voluntarily or involuntarily leave their own countries for economic reasons because of like severe economic conditions in their countries, and they need to seek out or to find other good opportunities or economic opportunities in the hosting countries, or in other attractive spaces or attractive countries, or for geopolitical reasons. They do flee, from wars, conflict, and political instability. And this is what push and pull theories actually would highlight. These approaches draw on the new classical economic perspectives, mainly in order to improve to advance their livelihoods and to find out good economic opportunities. And they highlight, the individual decisions of migration. So this is perhaps axiomatic, people would negative aspects in some countries would drive people out, for economic and geopolitical and political conditions, because of these kind of lack of economic opportunities or low living standards or war and conflict, and they got attracted, to other countries in order to improve, their economic conditions. Or perhaps for demographic reasons, the overly crowded, spaces, or overly crowded countries to sparsely populated countries. So they got attracted, for different reasons, in order to secure their physical safety, or to improve their economic opportunities, or to escape, some of the unattractive demographic reasons. The other traditional approaches, they highlight, these actually stem from Marxist traditions, that they highlight, this unequal exchanges of economic relations, highlighting the excessive, surpluses of cheap labor in some countries, and how advanced capitalist countries would make use of this stock of cheap labor. So these actually highlighted these approaches bring in the historical structural changes that led to these kind of unequal exchanges in economic transactions, but they focus on this mass recruitment of labor rather than individual voluntary decisions. So they focus on the structural conditions and historical conditions that actually drove people out, especially with the special focus on a specific category, which is labor migration, rather than any other category. So they highlight, the legacy of colonialism, that actually exploitative economic relations that led to this excessive supply of unskilled workforce that made them available for advanced capitalist nations to recruit. So basically, they bring on historical and structural factors that led to this mass recruitment of cheap labor. Any critique to these two approaches? They actually complement each other in a way, but there are some shortcomings in these approaches that they don't help us fully understand, this interdisciplinary nature of migrants and refugee as a phenomenon. Yeah, so the first approach, they highlight immediate conditions like economic and geopolitical or threatening conditions for the political or economic reasons, but they neglect these kind of historical context that paved the way, for these conditions to get aggravated or exacerbated. But this is what the historical structural approaches, try to fill in, like they filled in this gap, like the proponents or advocates of these Marxist approaches or historical structural approaches, they actually filled this gap, but still, they focused heavily on the predominance of the interest of capitalists, not the migrants' narratives. So they don't care, or they marginalize or gloss over, the narratives of individuals. So they highlight this kind of mass recruitment and structural conditions that led to or paved the way for this mass recruitment of cheap labor in advanced capitalist societies. But they didn't cast analytical light on the migrants' narratives. And this is what the recent interdisciplinary migration, system would bring in order to help us understand this from different or from interdisciplinary angles. As I mentioned, even with this kind of flourishing scholarly trends in these studies, like migration and refugee studies, is still state played important or pivotal role in these studies. So either the frame politics, because as a phenomenon, it's actually it affected the very every dimension of the social existence of human being or of these individuals, but still state is central in order to help us understand how state policies, how state discourse would actually affect these kind of production of narratives and production of public imagery, or would trigger some sort of action for the part of migrants in order to reshape these kind of social and cultural structures. So state is very central anyway, to these kind of to this interdisciplinary field of study. First of all, in order to highlight, in order to understand different patterns of migration, voluntary or involuntary, for economic reasons or for escaping, war and political instability, you need to understand state policies or the context and the historical context and structure in the sending states in order to understand these concerns or political, economic, and geopolitical concerns. So this would help us understand or come up with different patterns of migration, or we focus on receiving or hosting states in order to understand how the collaborative framework, how the sending and receiving states would actually collaborate or negotiate the legal frameworks that would organize, the visa policies, passport policies, and other regulatory framework that would actually help us understand the motives of the hosting countries in order to receive, these kind of migrants. And this would help us understand why some, especially European countries, would accept high-skilled labor force or workforce, and then they would actually consider labor or low-skilled migration as threatening to their countries. So this would help us understand the motives of these kind of receiving states, what kind of policies they adopt in order to regulate the migration or the immigration policies. And it would help us understand the securitization discourse. Under what condition, these kind of categories deemed threatening, and the conditions under which, these countries would receive a specific category of migrants. Or you need not necessarily sending or receiving, you need to understand the state as a sovereign entity in and of itself that would actually play with the nationality laws or citizenship regulations that would change, the citizenship position of their citizens. For example, by imposing curfew, they actually restrict the movement of their citizens or a specific category of population from one district or from one location to another. By adopting different developmental plans, as we are going to see in the seminar, like these kind of discourse of development that would this would lead to forced displacement or compulsory resettlement of a specific category of population, or they may like organize these kind of playing with the citizenship and nationality rule that would create a stateless category of specific citizens, as it happened with the Kurds in Syria. So, like, the state is central for different reasons. Either to understand patterns of migration, it depends on what you need to understand. Patterns of migration, or like, motives and policies of the receiving states, or like, how like the sovereign entity or the state itself would demarcate the boundaries within its territories in order to restrict the movement of segments of or particular segments of their population, of its population, by highlighting these kind of internal displacement, the statelessness issue, or citizenship rights. We're going to offer some examples, but we are going to here we are trying to understand why the state is central to this to the migration and refugee studies. So applying this to the Middle East, in order to understand, like some studies, in order to understand the patterns or the factors that actually drove people out of the sending states, so they highlight, different historical patterns of historical and recent patterns of labor migration to the European countries, or to the GCC or to the Gulf states. So, for example, you find like some studies, they highlighted, the immigration under the Ottoman Empire with the deterioration of the silk industries. So this actually pushed people for economic reasons, that they had like aspiration to improve, their economic status, or to find more good economic opportunities. This actually in Mount Lebanon, this actually drove people out of these of this locality, and in order to seek out different other good economic opportunities. Or like with the excessive supply of cheap labor, this actually increased demands from the European countries for mass recruitment of labor. That this led to more like the emergence of new collaborative framework between different countries, as it happened between Turkey and Germany. So they had like, the ratified, treaty in order to, for Germany to allow, guest workers. And then by adopting certain economic and social integration policies, these guest workers managed to transfer or to transform their status from guest workers to citizens. And then with the oil boom in the 70s and the Gulf War in 1991, this led to another a wave of immigration from different like Arab countries, non-oil countries, to the Gulf states. And here you see like Saudi Arabia is the most receiving country of labor migrants, and then Emirates. And then perhaps Turkey, and this peak happened perhaps after the Arab uprisings, because Turkey received too many Syrian refugees. Or when it comes to studying the patterns and the policies of the sending states, or the motives behind immigration, some studies highlighted the political economy of labor remittances. So how, these kind of labor remittances or these kind of rents affected rent states. For example, Chaudhry compared Yemen and Saudi Arabia, and how different kind of capital inflows. It's not oil; it's basically rents came from remittances, workers' remittances. So actually, this affected the institutional capacity or the development of the institutions in Yemen, because workers actually tried to get at they circumvented, the formal banking system. So this actually undermined, the banking capacity or the financial capacity of the state, and they enabled the emergence of good or like affluent private business or private sector. But the state actually managed to get around this by imposing like duties on import. This actually circumvented, the benefits that came from these kind of workers' remittances. And like it went like this, and it affected the institutional capacity of the state. Other than Saudi Arabia, the oil actually enabled them to build, some sort of good administrative apparatuses or bureaucratic apparatuses that actually enabled the state to manage its own economy. So this actually different patterns of capital inflows would affect basically the migrant labor workers. Their rents would affect the institutional and building capacity of some states. Others focus on how the state would use immigrants, how sending states would use their citizens in hosting states in order to serve, some purposes for foreign policy. As it happened, during the rising tide of Arab nationalism, Nasser actually used, its secondment policies in order to use teachers as a source of political activism in the sending state, in the hosting states. So actually, it served, they used, these kind of immigrants in order to serve, some foreign policy purposes, as it happened, with the case of Egypt under Nasser. So he used teachers in Libya in order to, as a source of political activism against King Idris, conservative monarchies in Saudi and in Kuwait as well. And this led to actually the deportation and the expulsion of different teachers or different Egyptian citizens or migrants who deemed threatening for these countries. Or they use, these kind of diaspora in order to change or to tell the balance of power in the sending state. So they use, their votes in order to support, some political camps or political parties, as it happened by giving, rights to vote to diaspora in Lebanon. This led to vote trafficking. Those who did, the Middle East course last semester, if you remember, this piece on vote trafficking. So they used, these kind of migrants in order to tilt, the balance of power in favor of one social or one political force. For the receiving states, in order to understand, these kind of motives of accepting migrants, why the state would accept, these kind of massive influx of different categories of immigrants. So any idea why this would, like the motives and the policies of these kind of receiving states, why the state would receive or would accept non-threatening categories of migrants? Yeah. Yeah, it's for economic and cultural considerations mainly. For economic, they might serve, the economic structures by offering, these kind of cheap labor or high-skilled, workforce that would benefit, the economic conditions or the economic structure as a whole, the economic operations as a whole. Or for cultural considerations, because people from the same cultural background could be easily integrated or assimilated into the receiving countries. So basically, they have these economic and cultural considerations in their mind before formulating or regulating, these kind of movement across borders. Any critique to this? Because the Middle East would unsettle these assumptions. We are getting to this shortly. But this is for economic and cultural considerations, basically. This trend actually neglected the possible politicization of the immigration policies or the migrants in the receiving states, as I just mentioned about secondment policies under Nasser and the Arab nationalism. They actually they became like a source of political activism, and they became a source of threat to the conservative monarchies. And this actually led to like some amendments or revisions in the citizenship law, and led to the deportation and expulsion of these immigrants. And again, like it unsettled, these kind of cultural considerations, because they altogether they came from, the same cultural background, but because of these kind of cultural, different ideological background or different political predispositions or ideological disposition, this actually undermined or eroded, these kind of the positive impact of cultural integration or cultural considerations. So coming from the same Arab background, didn't provide any guarantee to get assimilated or integrated easily in the societies of the hosting or the receiving states. Others would argue that integration it's a matter of like to what extent the state would apply smoothly these kind of integration policies. So for them it's a matter of time, and they highlight that these studies highlighted the political economy of time. So it's in order to transform this temporal position of disenfranchised citizen or foreign residents into full citizenship, it's a matter of time to get to get through these kind of naturalization process. So these kind of because of they have clear or the linear progression from to change the status from these kind of temporalities into permanent status of citizenship, so they might formulate their integration policies accordingly. But again, this is actually realistically unapplicable, not only in we're going to focus on the Middle East, but in other countries as well, because the state can get around or circumvent, these kind of linear progression from temporal state citizenship status to permanent or naturalization process. As we are going to see, this kind of, the state, had the authority and the power in order to change these rules or to get around, these legal frameworks that would create, these different statuses of citizenship that would create, as we were going to see, a limbo status, as it happened in Emirates, for example. They created, foreign residency as an innovative category in these countries, rather than deporting or or kicking them out. So they created, different category. I'm going to explain this in some detail shortly. But the point here, there is no linear progression. It's not a matter of time. The state had the authority and the power in order to keep them waiting and to in a process that is psychologically and financially costly for them. So this is actually, there is a disjuncture between these kind of registers of time and the end of temporality. So you need to bring back in the power dynamics or the motives of the state in order to create, different categories of citizenship status. So again, the MENA region unsettled, these kind of impartiality of time approaches. For example, security threat and this kind of undesirable category of Arab migrants led to deportation and expulsion of different Arab migrants. The hosting states actually created, these kind of category of temporal work permit that actually foreclosed opportunities or full access to citizenship rights. So the hosting states actually restricted, the access of migrants to some social services like health. They have limited access to health and education, but they didn't have full access to social safety net, pension scheme, or these kind of social dimensions or other social services. So they restricted, their access to this. they have the Gulf states and Lebanon, they have this kafala system. So they externalize, the cost to sponsors. So the kafil or the sponsor had to actually control, the sponsor controls, the movement of the migrants in order to change employers, in order to renew the residency, in order to terminate, or to change, to move between different countries. They have to find a sponsor in order to allow them to get in, or for the country to let them in. So this actually created, this category of permanently deportable guests or foreign residents in these countries, because they will be under the mercy of these kafils or these sponsors. As Ali mentioned, for humanitarian protection and the ad hoc legal status for refugee, the MENA region, or the Arab countries, or in the MENA region, actually they circumvented again, or got around, these kind of legal or humanitarian framework that would protect refugees from forcible return, or access to some social and economic rights. So the state actually increased, the burden of proof. So for refugees, in order to let them in, so the state actually increased, these kind of barriers by you have to prove, that you faced, these kind of persecution in this country, which is effectively or realistically could be impossible. So this actually, it added, new burden of proof, or the state actually, especially in the Gulf, and to some extent in Lebanon, they have these kind of racial and security considerations that led to the spatial segregation in camps or in the workplace, and discriminatory regulation to limit refugee moves. So they had some restrictive or constraining frameworks that led to the segregation, spatial segregation, and discriminatory regulations against them. As I mentioned, they created, this kind of limbo status, or temporality and revocable rights, by creating these kind of in-between status or statelessness status. For example, in the North African countries and Egypt and Emirates, recently they escaped this patrilineal citizenship. So mothers, women were not allowed, to give citizenship for their children. So the other way, to perpetuate or to reproduce these kind of temporality, in the Gulf state, they actually banned this dual nationality. So this created, permanent category of deportable or foreign residents in these countries, or stateless category. So there is a constant state of uncertainty when it comes to the status or the legal status of migrants and refugees, for different reasons: security, access to social and economic citizenship, for the kafala system or the sponsorship system, getting around, these kind of legal and humanitarian protection and the legal status for refugees by playing with different rules in order to prevent them from entering their borders, or by segregating or discriminating against them after entering, the borders. For the sovereign borders within the state, creating, restrictions and on movement, and forcibly displace or relocate specific categories of population. So the state may revisit, the nationality and citizenship law in order to create, these kind of stratified citizenship. For example, in Syria in 1961, with the rising tide of pan-Arabism and the threat of, non-Arabs, so Kurds actually tried to draw on this historical reservoir of their contentious action and demands for cultural and political autonomy. And this actually pushed the state in order to revisit the nationality and naturalization laws, and and they did, this kind of census or survey in order to ask them to provide a proof, that they were residents, in this country in the last, prior to 1945 for non-Arabs, which was technically difficult or if not impossible. And they actually created, this discourse that they are alien infiltrators or illegal migrants. And this actually stripped them of or robbed them of the citizenship rights and created the category of bidun, meaning without nationality. Like they created, this category of non-citizenship. Or Emirates actually innovated a new way in order to get around the naturalization law by creating, this kind of passport outsourcing. So they did purchase, the Comoros Island passport in order, instead of getting involved into extradition or expulsion activities. So they actually asked the foreign residents to provide a proof that they had this kind of خلاصة القيد family book, that they had this kind of lineage of relationship to specific Arab tribes. Otherwise, they had to purchase, the other, passport. So they created a new category of foreign residents within their own borders in order to get around, the naturalization process. And of course, these kind of Luri mentioned offshore citizens, so they lacked, full access to different social and economic citizenship rights, like housing, pension schemes, social safety nets, etc. So the state and this is what we are going to discuss in the seminar. So the state, with these kind of adopting or implementing these mega development projects, this would actually displace, certain segments of populations, and this within, the same category. This actually led to the compulsory resettlement in within their geographical territories, with different psychological, economic, and different transformation of the social organizations of these groups. And we are going to focus on the Nubians in Egypt and in Sudan in the seminar. So for the refugees, as we mentioned, the conceptual framework in order to understand, the refugee issue is the multi-level governance of refugees, because they need kind of collaboration between hosting states and international agencies that would provide technical and administrative or social support for refugees. So, do you have any idea when the when did the concept, emerge or coin?
Probably after World War II.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So actually, because of this kind of unprecedented, influx of immigrants, this actually produced, the different discourse, different institutional setup in order to deal, with new social and political phenomena. So this kind of mass displacement led to these kind of installation or establishment of refugee camps as a technique of political governance in order to make them a legible category or visible for service providers. So they created, these kind of setting up camps or shelters in order to provide them with administrative, technical, and social support. So it became much easier for international agencies in order to distribute some sort of material benefits, social goods, or psychological support for this category of the population. In the Middle East, Palestinians were the first to be considered as refugees after the emergence of the phenomenon after the Second World War, and then it became an issue of the third it was like it was framed as a third world problem because of this kind of the context of the decolonization and the emergence or the outbreak of sectarian strifes or civil wars, and then the not only economic deprivation but because of these kind of internal displacement that emanated from political instability and civil wars. So actually, the international organizations had to arrange with the nation state as a sovereign entity in order to regulate, these kind of processes of asylum seekers or refugees issues. So you need to, in order to bear on this subject or any, any issue related to the refugees, you need to bring to bring in the role of the state and the role of the international organizations. And this is the definition, the very definition of the refugee, like any person who is outside the country of his nationality because of because of fear or persecution or whatever reason, and he has if he has no nationality and he was unable to return to the country, so this actually would be considered as a refugee. This is the convention that would organize or regulate the relationship between the state or the hosting state and the refugee, that they are unable actually to return to their country. And this is the main issue in this the main issue of this framework. So they found themselves, for whatever reason, outside of the country of nationality, and the hosting states shouldn't force them to return to their country, because they could face any kind of torturing or persecution or other bad circumstances that actually drove them out of their country. MENA region is not a signatory to this convention. And the protocol that actually organized, this humanitarian protective framework. So the states shouldn't engage in, but they actually ratified, or they became part of this convention, that actually they shouldn't get engaged in forcible return, of refugees to their country should they face, any condition of torturing condition. But actually they did, some Sudanese and Syrians and basically Syria, Egypt, and Lebanon, they actually they violated the terms of this protocol, and they forcibly returned some of the Iraqis and Syrians and Sudanese refugees. And in some countries they denied access, they denied access to some economic and social services as well. So when countries, some MENA countries, when they let them in or they allowed them to get in, so they played with the regulations and the laws in order to create this kind of permanent deportable category or short-term residency, and this politics of uncertainty for the refugees, except for Syrians in Turkey. And do you know why it might be kind of exceptional? So they accepted, Syrian refugees, and they got them integrated and engaged in the formal. They became part of their formal economy, and this is because of the kind of the agreement between Turkey and EU in order to prevent the threat of illegal immigration. So that's why they agreed, on specific terms, and they received funds, for receiving these Syrian refugees. But apart from that, the state has the power and the authority to play with the rules and to get around, these kind of international humanitarian protection framework for the refugees, for the refugee rights. So what is the international protection framework? we will focus on, like, as I mentioned, Palestinians, were considered before, like, the Syrian crisis, Palestinians were the first to be considered as refugees in the Middle East. So, like and here is why the state is essential, why power dynamics, why politics is essential in order to understand this interplay or the interaction between the state and the international framework of, or international organization framework of the protection, of international protection. So, for example, like, international organization should have engaged actually in these kind of offering durable solutions to the Palestinian plight. So according to the international protection framework, it's kind of combined package, like either like return and getting, some sort of compensation, or resettlement, restitution, and repatriation. So the refugee should have the right, to choose between these kind of packages, but technically or realistically, Palestinians had no choice because of the power of Israel. So, for example, like, the two main organizational framework, the UNHCR and UNRWA, handled, these kind of Palestinian refugee issues, but actually they limited their operations to peacekeeping and peace servicing missions in order to offer some technical, administrative, and relief assistance to Palestinians. And they deprived UNHCR, for example, they deprived some individuals from receiving, other services if they receive, some other technical support or financial support from other UN agencies. So this actually enabled, these kind of organizations to deal, with the Palestinian refugees on individualistic basis rather than as a category, or other than a category of mass displacement, which is, again, like, getting around or circumventing, the article of the international convention, the Geneva Convention of Refugees. So this actually or the Palestinian case, as we are going to examine or to discuss in the seminar, highlight, not only the role of the international organizations in relation to or interaction to nation state or the sovereign state, because they have to reach an agreement in order to set up camps, in order to offer, these kind of relief or social services. They had like to agree to reach an agreement with the nation state in order to set up, these kind of camps, or in order to offer these services. But the case of Palestinians, would help us understand how this kind of institutional discourse or international discourse of development and offering, reliefs and technical administrative assistance depoliticized, the issue of refugees, and they actually marginalized or overlooked, the power dynamics and the legal structure, and these kind of legal architectures are a function of power dynamics rather than standalone legal framework that would organize the relationship between the state and the refugee issues. So we need to bring in politics. We need to bring in the role of the state and how the state would actually play with or tweak, these kind of nationality laws and regulations in order to create different categories or deprive even like native citizens or populations of their citizenship rights. And this is what we're going to discuss in the seminar. Away from this kind of centrality of the state, despite the fact that it does hold, these kind of trends, do hold some explanatory merit in order to understand the relationship between the state and immigration or migrants, in order to understand these kind of interactions in terms of patterns, motives, and policies, and the categories of the full access to citizenship rights of migrants. The migration system theory, they try to to overlook or they try to overcome, these kind of heavy focus on the state and bring in the agency of migrants and the narratives of the individuals back to the analysis. So, for example, they highlight the need to understand the motives and behavior from the standpoint of refugees, from the standpoint of individual migrants, and how individual migrants would transform, the social structures, institutions, and policies in the hosting states. And this actually, they built the argument on the notion of transnationalism as the immigration or this kind of the move across border or the population move across borders is no longer one way. There is kind of interaction between sending and receiving states, and this would affect these kind of political and economic and even cultural facts in the receiving states. For example, we're going to highlight how how immigrants, would develop, new forms or new categories of hybrid identities in the receiving states, how they would disturb, the balance of power or the political rule in the receiving states, and how they would affect, the economic structure by adding, some problems such as unemployment or more economic burden on the state in order to offer this access to social and economic services. So there are two main trends in this migration system theory in order to highlight first the historical context and the individual narratives, and the typical and the prototypical case is Kurds, how they draw on this kind of historical processes of decolonization in order to keep this image or the sense of community or the mental image of imagined community alive in their head, in order to make these kind of place outside of the enclaves or outside of the territorial spaces. As I mentioned last lecture, they draw on the history of activism against the Ottoman Empire, and then the history of marginalization and persecution in Syria and Iraq in order and they draw on their organizational networks or intellectual production in order to have, this to keep, this constructed image of community alive. And this is what they used in order to have their own self-autonomous region after the outbreak of the Arab uprisings in the Rojava. And the second trend in this kind of migration system theory, it's the interaction between the migrants and the hosting states. So the central point here, migrants are not passive recipient of these kind of policies like nationalization and citizenship and naturalization policies. They actually might shape the entire social organizations and the political structure in the hosting countries. For example, they might produce or generate conflict and help emergence of different patterns of activism. And the prototypical case is the PLO in Lebanon. Anyone knows what happened in Lebanon with the Palestinian Liberation Organization? Yeah, okay. So basically, the PLO was functioning in Jordan in order to launch military operation against Israel. Okay, and then they tried, to disturb, the throne of the king by hijacking, some civilian airlines, and they threatened with blowing up, some airlines and taking hostage of some civilians. And this actually eroded the political authority of the king in Jordan, and in what became as Black Friday in 1970 in Jordan. So the PLO tried to find another territorial space in order to launch its military attack on Israel from, and they relocated themselves in Lebanon by creating these kind of refugee camps. And the refugee camps actually offer them extraterritorial site for radicalization. So they offer them like, political technique in order to govern and manage, some recruits in order to organize their military action against Israel. So what happened, this actually triggered, some social divisions inside Lebanon and heightened sectarianism between Christians, militia, and the PLO and some leftist organization, that the whole country actually slided into the civil war in the late 70s. And this actually led to later to the Israeli invasion and Beirut siege in 1982. And the international community had to intervene in order to reach, this kind of settlement, or to reach an agreement in order to end the occupation, or to have this kind of evacuation of the Israeli forces from Lebanon. So this is how immigrants would actually disturb, the political structure or the political institutions in the hosting countries as well. And this is what the migration system theory tries to understand: the agency of the migrants, or the individual narratives, and how they construct and reconstruct social realities in order to keep, to inscribe, or to have this kind of, to envision, nation state or community-based project, as it happened with the case of Kurds in